Hello. So for this video for Election Day 2022, although I may reshare this on social media for future election days, hopefully women's rights will not once again be a major issue. But for this Election Day 2022, where women's rights are a major issue, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Sentiments, which was proposed at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. As somebody raised in Western New York, Rochester, the Seneca Falls Convention was pretty well regarded as local history, even though Seneca Falls itself is more sort of central New York. But major players in the mid-19th century women's suffrage movement, especially Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, have very strong Rochester connections. So the Declaration of Sentiments is very much part of my own sort of personal history. The Declaration itself was written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the other major figures of the 19th century feminist movement. Basically, the Declaration of Sentiments follows the pattern of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but it puts forward the case that women need to engage in a kind of political revolution in order to ensure for themselves the rights that are theoretically already guaranteed to them by the Declaration of Independence. And so a lot of the language in the Declaration of Sentiments actually mirrors what we get in the Declaration of Independence, but the focus is not on here is what we, the American colonists, object to about the king's treatment of us. The focus is here is what we, women of America, and in reality it wasn't all women in America, this was a divisive issue. There were a decent number of women who did not support the suffrage movement, but that's not that crucial. We, the women of America, or the women of the Seneca Falls Convention, are being oppressed by men in these ways. So you get this utilization of core U.S. political rhetoric, which is a very effective tool to try and make the political case for the importance of women's suffrage. So it starts out, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this is a really important thing. First off, that is almost verbatim from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, with the addition of women. There's these slight shifts that make it clear that what they are doing at the Seneca Falls Convention is precisely the same kind of thing that the American colonists had done in 1776 to declare their independence from Great Britain. One of the points that's really important here is this idea, and this is fundamental to the American experiment as such. And this is actually also on the ballot in the early 2020s, probably not just 2022, but probably 2024 as well, given the amount of election denialism and voter repression, etc., etc. But this idea that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is why democracy is important in the American experiment, and that democracy has always, or almost always, been incomplete, but it has generally expanded and only really recently substantially contracted. But this idea, basically the argument that is being made in the Declaration of Sentiments is fundamentally that women are subject to the US government, but they have no say whatsoever because they are denied the vote, because they are denied the ability to speak in public, the ability to engage in politics, etc., etc. Because women are denied these rights, they have no ability to consent or to refuse their consent to the government under which they live. Therefore, this is a government that does not derive its just authority from the consent of the people, because the people, which includes women, simply has no mechanism to consent or refuse consent. And this is a recurring theme as they get into the specific set of grievances. As Stanton gets into the specific set of grievances, again, this is modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The middle portion of the Declaration of Independence is the set of grievances. The king has done this, the king has done this, the king has done this, and all of this is unjust. Same thing here. Men have done these things that are unjust to women. So, and again, a lot of this revolves around denying women a political voice, denying women a place in the political sphere, the public sphere, etc., etc., and setting up tyrannical authority over women in the language that Stanton uses. So she says here, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. Women at this point in the US had never had the vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. Again, this idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. There needs to be a mechanism through which one can consent or refuse consent in order for that fundamental principle of Enlightenment-era liberalism to be enacted. And again, that's central to the Declaration of Independence. It's central to the American experiment, etc., etc. I'm just sort of skipping through these to the ones that I think are most important to the point that I'm making here. We've got, having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. Because women can't consent or refuse to consent to particular government or particular laws, men can do what they want to women, and there's nothing that women can legally, politically, or socioculturally do to stop them. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. Now, this is an important point. What the footnote here in the Norton Anthology of World Literature says is, civil death is a legal term for those who have lost their civil rights, traditionally because they've committed a felony. Women in 1848 essentially had the same legal rights as convicted criminals. And the reason for that was that women had no right to own property, they had no right to vote, they had no right to hold political office. All of these rights that are fundamental to American citizenship were denied to women because their status as married people made them effectively their husband's property. On a related note, he has taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns. Again, women had no legal right to own property unless they had no male relative. So there were some exceptions, like widows could own property, for instance, but if they remarried, all of their property, even if it had always been their property, all of their property would go to their husband. After depriving her of all rights as a woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. Taxation without representation. Women who did own property, such as single women with no male relative, widows, etc., were subject to paying tax, but they had no voice in government, no voice in determining what those taxes would go to, what the tax rates would be, etc. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. This is less about government and more about larger socioeconomic forces. Women made lower salaries than men. Women still make lower salaries than men on average. And this was a systemic inequality. He closes against her all avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. Certain professions closed to women. He has denied her the faculties of obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her, limits to education, what knowledge women were allowed to receive. He allows her in the church as well as state, but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. So, we have here a series of things. Women are only allowed to work for lower wages and in generally less prominent industries. There are certain industries that are absolutely closed to women. Educational opportunities are limited, and the ability to be part of the religious life of the community is limited. In the 1840s, religion was a massive part of communities and a massive part of how people experienced their lives. So to be excluded from positions of authority in that was a major detriment in a way that in modern secular communities, it wouldn't necessarily be as much. And then one of the last ones, the last sort of point before we get to the sort of summing up, is he has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. The destruction of women's self-esteem, self-confidence, belief that they can achieve any objective that a man could achieve has been a massive, massive component of the anti-feminist movement. And then we get to sort of the end here. Again, in the Declaration of Independence, there is a sort of summing up that reiterates key ideas, key objectives. In the Declaration of Sentiments, we have the same thing. So it says, now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. Unfortunately, in 2022, we may need to echo that sentiment. Happy voting.